Thank you all for your attention. I'll now turn it over to Nita, who is our session chair.
Thank you for joining us at this very exciting session during ILERA. It's been an interesting opportunity and the researchers have done some fantastic work here. We're going to go in the order of the program, so I would invite Asmita to please present. Throughout this, again, as a reminder, if you've got questions, please put them in the question box and we'll follow up with that after the fact. Asmita, you'll have about 15 minutes to do your presentation. Go ahead.
Great. I'm just going to start sharing my screen and go to the top. Okay. I think I'm gonna switch off my video because it looks like I need to juggle a bit here. So. Okay. So hi, I'm Asmita, and I'm a first-year PhD student of adult education. This paper is a synthesis of my personal experiences as a worker in NGOs in India. These experiences served as a springboard to kind of begin an exploration, more of a theoretical exercise, at least in the presentation today, to come up with an analysis and framework for workplace learning. Okay, why is this not moving forward? Okay. With over 1.2 million NGOs, India has an incredibly diverse NGO sector providing services in the health, education, and the other structures of civil society. I'm going to focus mainly on education-based NGOs. The nature and systems of learning within education-based NGOs in India has undergone a transformation with the changing political and economic conditions in the country. Workplace learning in these organizations was informal earlier and limited to creating affect and passion, since most of the workforce was voluntary. However, with the neoliberal reforms of the 90s and FDI's, foreign direct investments, flowing in, we saw a quantitative increase of organizations in the sector and increased investment from local and international sources. This led to an ever-growing need to formalize and standardize the teaching learning processes involved in these projects. The sector placed an increased expectation on trainers or facilitators to master appropriate cognitive and affective skills required for the implementation of projects in the field, and hence the prevalence of skill-based curriculum for workplace learning. I mainly reflect on my own experiences within three education-based NGOs that I worked in the country in the capacity of a curriculum developer and adult learning facilitator in these organizations. And in that positionality, I was also in proximity to the decision-making bodies, funding agencies, and the on-ground facilitators. So these organizations were, as you see on your screen, characterized by these three common aspects. To go deeper into the training and learning activities, I looked into the literature on adult education and learning in NGOs in India and discovered that it had scarcely been interpreted from the lens of critical pedagogy. Instead, several research studies at the intersection of learning in NGOs focus on, one, developing entrepreneurial skills amongst the leaders and workers of the organization, focusing on individual agency, and then strategies for developing life skills in NGO workers with emphasis on self-development, emotional intelligence, and motivation. And then, of course, effective evaluation frameworks to assess the impact of the learning activity geared towards easing out the procurement of funding for these projects. So the literature that focuses, as we've seen, on cognition, expertise, and the individual emphasizes the importance of self-selected learning projects and suggests the construction of an enterprising self as instrumental to the workplace learning agenda. To me, this literature aligns the discourse of workplace learning with that of neoliberal logics of individualism and commodification that place the worker in an unending cycle of acquiring marketable skills and place the responsibility of achievement and failure on the individual. Though a preliminary understanding suggests that permanent pedagogy is not limited to acquiring of skills through training or certifications, but manifests itself at the levels of cultural norms and ethos of a workplace. But it then became important for me to understand that what is the role of individual and collective agency in workplaces, and what are the characteristics of this kind of pedagogy? What does worker resistance against it mean or look like? And that's when I went to what kind of theories that I should be looking at, and I used chat, a theory influenced by Vygotskian's social constructivist approach and Leontiev's ideas on activity to understand permanent pedagogy itself as an activity. And since proponents of chat themselves also identify its limitations in conceptualizing the collective agency, I use Freire's cultural synthesis for a framework for resistance. So these are the three characteristics that I could sum up as far as if we consider permanent pedagogy as activity. And I'm going to talk about each one now. So in the NGOs that I worked with, a rigorous training schedule was always a critical part of the annual plan. Self-development workshops and retreats, outsourced and internal trainings, encouraging workers to get certified on different aspects, as well as pushing them towards a goal to keep learning. Tara Fenwick, who's worked a lot on chat and workplace learning, talks about how this activity in the workplace of learning, training, etc., is mediated not only through the direct pedagogy, but also through other materials like tools, artifacts, techniques, ideas, stories, memories. Also the way people must dress themselves at work, the language that they're going to use or that is considered appropriate, the way people deal with a conflict situation, or how workers spend their informal time during breaks, and the ways they celebrate events. So the activity is therefore continuous and furthered through an interconnected set of relations, as we can see here. All the NGOs that I worked for, the learning facilitators who were the primary people who would go on ground and conduct these programs in the schools with children or with young adults, were engaged in annual organizational vision developing exercises. In this, the vision statement, the program, and the assessment methods were all imagined to be co-created to ensure that the workplace is perceived as a democratic one. However, in my positionality as a curriculum developer and trainer, it was clear that the objectives, the processes, and the evaluation criteria of all of these programs were usually pre-decided for funding and recruitment purposes. So the training exercise aimed to only craft a narrative of inclusive decision-making, whereas in fact, it wasn't the case. In such workplaces where the workers are often labeled as change-making agents, their own status, ironically, never changes as far as their learnability is concerned, and is rather situated in an unending continuum of learning. This narrative is accompanied with precarious work, low wages, and also these workplaces are gendered in a way that most of these workplaces employ women or young women who are graduates fresh out of college or undergrad. Now, such activities are representative of the more gigantic facade of neoliberal institutions that create a narrative of choice, freedom, equality, and learning, whereas at the same time, individualizing the responsibility of performance and achievement at work. The activity is therefore ridden with contradictions and reducing worker subjectivity even further. In these nonprofits, another aspect is that there is a discourse, there's a mainstream discourse of these nonprofits being humanitarian and anti-profit, that all the activities have nothing to do with profit making, and that it is not a corporate type organization. However, it is common to use standardized operating procedures of instruction and knowledge transfer to equip workers with the desired set of skills and behavior. Additionally, in nonprofit setups, the dependence on external funding to run projects forces a need to produce objective and highly numerical assessment techniques to be applied for the evaluation of workers as well as the projects. These mechanized and now increasingly automated processes in which workers are immersed often erase the subjectivity of human interaction. Also, the reliance on numbers and standards segregates the efforts and abilities of different individuals, which in turn induces the notion of competitiveness and in performance and achievement. So what could then resistance look like against the hegemonic ways in which permanent pedagogy is institutionalized? Reflection probably on artifacts such as the written text in an organization, whether it's policies, norms, wage equity statements, and the like, is an essential first step. If workplaces intend to be spaces of learning, then spaces of reflection, individual as well as collective, must be created or even demanded by the workers. Smet, in his book, A Dialectical Pedagogy of Revolt, borrows ideas from Vygotsky and Sartre and remarks that a revolt against the dominant shall entail external performances of retaliation, but also internalization of the collective action. So the struggle of workers against management or employer produces the object of the activity of resistance, which is oriented externally as a means to mediate the relations between workers and bosses. But this instrument also must turn inward, organizing and structuring the collective actor instead of being an individual actor, turning a volatile and amorphous collaboration of wage workers into a stable system of activity. So Freire's principle here of collective consciousness is of particular importance. The object of the activity of oppression here that needs attention, therefore, is not really only the individual person or the worker, but also the conscious purpose of the workplace. It is important to emphasize here that this discussion of contesting one's oppression assumes that individuals or collective of workers understand that the attempt towards consciousness and liberation is still situated in the larger domains of neoliberalism, and in that context, keep challenging the organizations. The fossilized behavior that we spoke about earlier and the belief of self-depreciation, when reflected upon, defossilized and deconstructed, can then lead to creating or even acting upon new actions. So the idea that simply reflecting on artifacts or simply reflecting on what's not going okay or where are the oppressive structures based is not enough, but there needs to be an action that leads to resist mechanized operations of these workplaces. And Freire talks about it in great details when he talks about cultural action and cultural synthesis, saying that cultural action is a systematic and deliberate form of action that operates upon a social structure, either with the objective of preserving that structure or of transforming it. Workplaces that merely insert the words empower or transformation, that is clearly not enough. They're synthesizing a mode for contradicting, questioning, and deconstructing the culture itself is of prime importance. And here is a diagram which I am not too sure if I have too much time to speak about, but I'll just leave you with this. It's also, unfortunately, not very clear, but it talks about, it kind of builds on Vygotsky's model of scaffolding of how workers and the management in a particular workplace need to be working together, or the workers, when they form like a collaborative transformative process, then what does that process really look like? And if there are people who are at a higher level of consciousness raising when it comes to this kind of work, then what role can they play? So yeah, that's about it. And I don't know how to get out of this. Okay, yeah.
There you go, you've got that.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I do have one question, but it's a generic question thus far. So I'll wait until the end to ask that one and allow others to have an opportunity to react as well. Are there any other questions on this topic? I'll amalgamate the questions at the end. We still don't have Martha online. Martha, are you online? If you're there, please just speak up. In that case, why don't I move to Sarah Dubois, who will be presenting a paper on Northern Ontario workplaces and gender segregation. Thank you so much for your time, Asmita. Sarah, over to you.
Okay, I'm just sharing my screen now, or just a second here. Is that okay? Is everyone able to see the screen and hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'll start in. Hey there, my name is Sarah Dublua, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Human Studies and Interdisciplinary Program at Laurentian University. To provide some brief context as to my current research, my dissertation sets the goal to better understand gender segregation in the Northern Ontario workplace, where focus lands on understanding the experiences of blue-collar women in mining. Northern Ontario supports a plethora of mining activity, Sudbury especially, given its establishment in the mining community in light of its rich geological rock structures and formations. The Sudbury Basin itself was formed as a result of one of the largest known impact craters. Rich deposits of copper, nickel, palladium, and other valuable metals discovered in the area make the Greater Sudbury region one celebrated for its mining opportunities. In the top right of this image, the crater-filled Wanapitei Lake can be seen, the community of Sudbury to its direct left, and in the center of this aerial view. Mines are located all across the extremities of the city and support an integral part of the Greater Sudbury workforce. But that said, given that women were not legally permitted to work underground until 1978, the Mining Act, and the fact that women were rarely employed even in surface jobs up until or before this time, mining has a long history of being male-dominated. Its workforce having been established in the mining industry, it might come as no surprise that the literature has defined Sudbury traditionally as a man's town. Mining is often perceived a quintessential blue-collar occupation, embodying many of the features that are so central to blue-collar work, including the fostering of a masculine organizational culture and being emblematic of work that's tough, that's dirty and dangerous and competitive. Though efforts have certainly been made, especially in more recent years, so to support diversity in the mining industry and other blue-collar environments as well, recent statistics tell us that location dependent across Canadian mine sites, women hold only somewhere between 6 to 17% of jobs, where most of these jobs predominantly fall within administrative roles, falling in line with jobs that are historically gendered as women's work. The gendering of work roles has been all too prevalent in many milieus of the workforce, where markedly the mining industry has maintained especially problematic levels of occupational gendered segregation. And as labor and employment scholars, we know that work is central. It's central to our human identity. It's much more than a set of physical and mental undertakings, but it's a social endeavor, and the workplace is a social institution that's imbued with all sorts of complexities, including interpersonal relationships, work groups and subcultures, and intergroup dynamics. Our work impacts our moral value and our happiness, our self-image, our worldviews, and even our survival. There's a great deal of cultural meaning that's associated with work, and with the knowledge that employed women in the Canadian mining industry are so very few and far in between, especially within blue-collar work roles. What's it like for women to work within these hypermasculine workplace environments, and what are the challenges and triumphs? In my own personal belief, it's only in providing narrative space for these voices of traditionally marginalized women to be heard that we can start and continue to work towards continued equity, diversity, and inclusion within this work environment. So formally, the following research questions have guided my project. First, what are the gendered experiences of blue-collar women working in Sudbury, Ontario mines? As gendered others, what perceptions do blue-collar women working in Sudbury, Ontario mines have of the blue-collar workplace culture and climate? How do blue-collar women working in Sudbury mines perceive they're treated and communicated with by their colleagues in this primarily masculine organizational culture? And finally, how do blue-collar men working in Sudbury mines perceive the blue-collar women that they work with? How do they perceive they treat and communicate with these blue-collar women? Now, important to note here is that the term that you use others presented in my second research question is one that's directly derived from the literature that represents the common experience for women in male-dominated blue-collar occupations to often feel as outsiders. And my reading has informed me that the majority of research regarding women's blue-collar work experiences has tended to often focus within construction and trade operations. Though some research has been conducted as it regards gendered work experiences in mining, research with focus in the mining industry in Northern Ontario is especially lacking. And I think we really need to better understand what's going on in these work environments today to continue to work towards, again, that equitable, diverse workforce in the future. My dissertation received ethical approval from my university March 18th of this year. In light of the ongoing pandemic, I conducted interviews over the phone, as well as using mutually agreed upon video chat platforms like Zoom. All interviews were audio recorded so that conversations were able to be fully transcribed for my analysis. To participate in the research project, participants had to self-identify as workers currently working in a blue-collar role in a mine in Greater Sudbury. Though most work experiences regarded work within here's Greater Sudbury's region, some workers had additional work experience within other mines of Northern Ontario. My initial pool of participants derived from a small set of personal acquaintances who met the project's participant criteria, and a snowball sampling technique for my methodology supported the additional recruitment of participants. To date, I have interviewed 11 men and 22 women for this project, with the average interview duration with men at 33 minutes and women at 61 minutes. Now, I decided to follow Laplanche's tenet that only in capturing narratives about the work experiences of both men and women can a project begin to draw conclusions that start to explain some gender dynamics at work. Given that my project seeks to focus on understanding women's gendered experiences, however, it was deemed appropriate that about 2/3 of those interviewed would be self-identified as women and 1/3 self-identifying as men. Whereas blue-collar women were asked to speak to their direct work experiences in the mines, blue-collar men were asked to speak to their work experiences directly with women, as well as their perceptions of women working within these blue-collar roles in the industry. Given that my last interview to support the project was only just conducted last week, the first interview March 30th and the final the 17th of June, I'd like to explain that my analysis is very preliminary in its stage, and a much more in-depth analysis is definitely to come in the months to follow, and I intend to adopt an interdisciplinary critical discourse analysis so to examine not only what participants have said in interview, but also the language that they've used, as well as in what context and coding will support this process. Again, I reiterate my findings are quite preliminary at this time, but I have been able to find 4 emerging themes from my initial analysis of what has been transcribed material of 28 hours and 25 minutes of conversation. First, that blue-collar work environments in Sudbury mines continue to foster a masculine organizational culture. Masculinity is highly valued within this work environment, as are characteristics commonly associated with masculinity, such as toughness, roughness, and physical strength. Nearly all of the women I interviewed either worked exclusively with men or very near exclusively. Most spoke to a feeling of being an outsider or an other in their work environment, at least at one point in time. And this was especially true near the beginning of a woman's career, or if by chance she moved to a very brand new mine location with new colleagues. Some, however, shared that they still internalize this feeling regularly. Others that over the course of time, significant time might have passed, that they've gradually felt more integrated and comfortable working with their peers, again, that are predominantly men. Regardless of the case, common statements did allude to a sense of discomfort being one of, or one of the only, or perhaps the only woman in this work environment. Definitely all eyes were on me going underground, spoke one woman, whereas another explained that I was always physically surrounded by just generally men, and just being the only female, you're a bit more of the center of attention. You get a lot of unwanted attention. Second, and that which expands on the idea of this unwanted attention is the notion of harassment that is experienced by blue-collar women within mining. Not all, but many of the blue-collar women that I interviewed spoke to experiences of gendered harassment on the job, even if they didn't personally label this treatment as such. While not every woman had a specific story or stories to tell related to personal instances of harassment on the job, nearly all women interviewed alluded to this necessity of a tough skin or ability to brush it off their shoulders. It's representative of unwanted attention or behavior or comments that they deemed inappropriate towards them in the workplace. Most often, harassment was spoken by the women as instigated by their male coworkers, though a few of the women also spoke to instances of harassment as instigated in interactions with them by their male supervisors. A great deal of the verbal and physical harassment shared by the women was sexualized in nature, and this aligns with a lot of the literature that I read prior to conducting my own study on the harassment experienced by women in blue-collar occupations. Notably, I'd like to stress that I do recognize that the definition of what constitutes harassment differs between person to person, and I definitely need to explore this topic further as I continue to move forward with my project. Speaking to your own experiences as a woman in a male-dominated work environment in mining, however, one woman explained that what happens is you get badgered and bugged and harassed, and it's repetitive stuff. Sharing a personal experience within her own words, another woman explained that one day I'm working on a bench and this supervisor slides up along the bench as I'm working and his hand cups my breast. For another woman still, fear was instilled in her when she started to explain to me that gradually she felt as though one or perhaps more of her colleagues seemed to think that she just didn't belong. Upon entering what was supposedly a female-only change room or dry, she discovered vandalism to her personal belonging. My jacket was actually sliced up with a knife, and you could just see it, just shreds. And I'm thinking, does this person wish that I was dead? Finally, explaining the persistence of harassment in her treatment on the job, yet her simultaneous resistance to report her concerns to her company's HR unit in light of feeling as though she wouldn't be taken seriously, one woman said, I was harassed every day. Like their sexual and harassment and their bill C-168 is such bullshit. It's all bureaucracy just put there, but don't try to execute it. Notably, I became aware that most of the instances of harassment shared with me were not reported by these blue-collar women. For these women, fear of not being believed by, be it their coworkers, their supervisors, or even their workplace establishment, deterred them from voicing their concerns. Additionally, it was shared that future repercussions of being labeled that woman, that tattletale woman, essentially, who complains about her circumstances, only further inhibited these women from voicing their struggles in the workplace. Third, my data led me to draw the preliminary conclusion that many blue-collar women working in Sudbury mines face perceived gender challenges, achieving acceptance, respect, and equality in the workplace. We work a lot harder than the men to prove ourselves, voiced one woman. It's this underlying thing, like I just feel like I need to work twice as hard just to make sure that I am as valued or more valued or whatever else, spoke another. To be accepted and respected in the workplace as equals, many of the women and men interviewed alluded to this ideal identity of the female blue-collar worker in the mines, embodying the identity of one of the guys or one of the boys. Being considered one of the guys or one of the boys was seemingly a major triumph. That means having reached this very challenging milestone of equal respect within the workplace. This is precisely how one woman defined this term for me upon my inquiry into its meaning. As one male participant explained, if you can pick up 50 pounds and you can do what I do in a day, well, you're just one of the guys. You're one of the people, one of the workers. These masculine terms of reference, full circle, bring us back to the masculine organizational culture, so pervasive even today within this industry. Albeit ongoing gendered struggles particular to women within this industry, however, I must also note the many triumphs experienced by these women, which leads me to my final and fourth preliminary finding as reflective of the collected data in the time that permits today. That being the majority of blue-collar workers in Sudbury mines find high levels of job satisfaction. And this was true of both the men and women that I spoke with and interviewed for the current project. Near the end of each interview, I asked each participant, do you like your job? Though a more precise analysis certainly necessitates here, I can say that about 75 to 80% of those participants responded with a seemingly very confident yes. In fact, 7 of the 22 women I spoke to spoke the exact same words in the same order. I love my job. Others spoke this sentiment using their own unique words. Being tangibly able to see the progress of one's work is something that seems to make blue-collar work in the mine satisfying to these workers. The camaraderie between colleagues discussed by many of the interviewees could be another reason for such enjoyment of this work environment. Many refer to their colleagues or crew as a second family. Even the women that did express their instances of harassment on the job, for the most part, eventually also spoke to their passion for their work, as well as respect that they feel that they finally, though often with exhaustive effort, garnered in the workplace. While not condoning her experiences of harassment, one woman explained that the guys are great. I love them, they love me, but there has been the odd few over the years that, for lack of a better saying, ruin it for the rest of us. I'm sure to pull very many more findings from the interview transcripts already that will enable me to provide a more holistic account and true account of the industry and its ongoing gender segregation. But I have a belief that this project starts to speak to the courage, resiliency, and determination of many blue-collar women in mining. My exploration as to this topic is, of course, merely at its very beginning. Thank you.
Great work, Sarah. You do have one question that's specific to your analysis, so I'll just address that here. Do you see a similar trend in mining and oil that's happening with millennials not necessarily being interested in the workforce? So what's going on at the intersection of millennials, gender, and then working in the mining industry?
Do you mean
Did you consult for age? Was there a difference in age group representation? For example, we know that younger generations are generally more gender fluid and less male dominated. You know, their philosophies are slightly different.
Great question, because that's definitely going to be a finding as I move forward with the project that I believe will surface. That was something that was very much discussed by several participants, both male and female, that there is an intergenerational difference in ways of communicating, that certainly the heightened awareness that has taken place in our society within recent years, such as the Me Too movement, for instance, has created some perhaps more acceptance of gender diversity within the workplace. So this was definitely something that came up in definitely more than a few of my interviews.
So you will be looking into the concept of intergenerational differences a little bit further.
Absolutely, absolutely.
There was a second question that came in that's unique to your paper as well, and that was this idea that we've talked about, how women felt excluded, but in what ways did women feel integrated or included in a male-dominated culture? Did you see that? As well as a secondary question about the frequency of harassment incidents. So do you have anything around inclusiveness in the work environment, and then another one around frequency of harassment?
Yes, so that feeling of inclusiveness tended to take place after quite some time being within the industry. So those sentiments of feeling as outsiders or as others tended to be at the beginning of a woman's career, or rather perhaps if they'd moved to a new mine site. I actually had a few of the women I spoke with that said that when they moved to a new mine site, it was almost like starting a brand new with new colleagues, again, that are predominantly male colleagues, and that often these challenges surfaced once again. And so this resiliency and determination, so to surpass these challenges could by chance take place all new in a new work environment. As for the instances of harassment and its frequency, this was largely dependent on the individual. I was surprised at how many women had received or been the individual receiving end of harassment. However, it was shockingly disappointing how much harassment seemed to still take place. But again, I'm cautious of utilizing even that term at this point, because I think it needs a lot more analysis on my part, so to be able to understand and give it the time that it really deserves and requires to be able to understand that in much more depth. But very dependent on the individual in that case. Excellent,
thank you for that. We did just get one more question into you, and that is in the chat function here. Salil really appreciated your presentation and says that you've got some similar findings to the Wyoming coal mines. The question was, other than loving your job, what are the coping mechanisms that women are using in order to overcome some of the biases that they're feeling or make sense of their experiences?
Sure. So I'd like to speak to the term sisterhood. Brotherhood is a term that is often utilized in many blue-collar work unions, and it's actually a term that's still used in some unions today. And it really isn't an inclusive term to gender identities that do not fall within that masculine identity. Mining industry is one that does often celebrate brotherhood. I was very, very happy to hear the term sisterhood utilized by many of the women that I spoke with. Not only connecting with women perhaps at that same mindset, because as I mentioned, predominantly most of these women worked exclusively on their own as the individual female with men. But there was quite a few connections made with women in some of the larger corporations that exist here in Sudbury, such as virtual connections like we're able to do today. And so that was something that I believe very much has supported these women in coping with their experiences, especially those that for many would be extremely debilitating. And unfortunately, the term the revolving door has been used by many of these women and in the literature as many women start into this industry. The reason why these numbers continue to be so few is that these experiences of harassment, of feeling as an outsider, often find these women turning full circle around and jumping into another industry. And unfortunately, it is this also internal resiliency, I do believe, and this internal strength. And that term strength is something that's really important here, because strength is often associated with physicality, but there's emotional and mental strength that is so surpassing the physical strength that these workers need to embody. And a lot of the women that I spoke to seem to have this resiliency and mental, emotional, and physical strength as a triumph. And I think that this really has supported their coping experiences too.
Excellent job. Thank you so much. And I really like that link, because I know Asmita was talking also about moving from the individualist to the collectivist, and you're speaking in regards to that.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Thank
Perfect.
you. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, Sarah, I'll ask you to go on mute. Thank you for that. And we'll move on to Johanna, who will be presenting on behalf of her team. Anytime you're ready, Johanna.
Perfect. Just clicking all the things. Okay, you can see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. So I'm presenting, yes, on behalf of myself and some others. So Dr. Amanda Coles is at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and then 2 graduate students who helped me at Western on various aspects of this project, Chandell, Gosse, and Victoria O'Mara. And so I've been, this is an interesting panel, because we go, you know, from NGOs to blue collar mining spaces to now the digital game industry or the video game industry, but there are real themes and similarities all across. So I think that's quite interesting. And so here I'm talking about this diversity problem in the digital game industry. And by that, specifically for this paper, we're talking about the problem of the underrepresentation of women and the treatment of women in the game industry. And we're specifically trying to kind of disentangle these different views that men hold and that women hold about why is there a persistent underrepresentation of women, which links to, you know, I like your design a bit there, Sarah, in talking to the men and the women, because sometimes I think we can focus just on the women and maybe miss some of that comparative piece. So what is the diversity problem insofar as the game industry? I've been working for a number of years with the International Game Developers Association to put out and analyze what they call developer satisfaction surveys. And so some of this data here is coming from one that we worked on in 2015. And in that survey, one of the questions was asking about whether the respondents perceived that there was a negative societal perception of the game industry. And the respondents to this survey are largely game developers themselves, so people that make video games, but also what we call the game community. So there are game journalists, people who write game-related news, but also event planners and people who kind of flesh out that industry more broadly, academics who might make games as part of their work. So this, from a broad population, 52% said there was a negative societal perception. And when we then supplementary question asked them, well, you know, what is it? Why is that negative perception there? 57% said it was because of a perception of sexism among gamers. 52% talked about sexism in the game content itself. 40% talked about sexism in the workforce. And then 35% talked about a lack of overall diversity in general. And those were not exclusive categories. And then across these surveys over a number of years, because we've been looking at the data since about 2009, rough estimates would suggest that about 22% of the digital game workforce identifies as female. But as people who study gender know, when we look at the most core roles that are associated with game development, for instance, computer programming, and we kind of cut out those ancillary roles like journalists, like event planners, like administrators or human resource management professionals, we see that the number drops quite significantly down to about 11%. So also just some data in terms of the background experience of this diversity problem is that the literature, and I haven't listed it all here or any of it here, but there's lots of it, points to gendered preparatory experiences for people who work in games. It really is a culture that is born from a young age to go into being a game developer. And so what this slide shows here is we asked students about the percent of women in their class. And so we see that the dominant response there, 22% say, well, there are fewer than 10% women in their classes. And, you know, if we look at gender parity there at 50%, 50% and above is a much smaller proportion. So we see that women are scarce then in these typical pipelines into the game industry. But we also see in the literature a lot of evidence that the nature of the pipeline into the game industry is also highly gendered. So we see lots of evidence that access to gameplay is gendered among children. We see that the types of games played is gendered. So men and women play different games, and the industry values those games differently, casual games versus more hardcore games. And we also see that there are gendered experiences while playing. So when boys and girls play games together, girls give up their controller more frequently, whereas boys hold on to their controller and maintain their play for longer, and they develop a different sense of mastery. And all of these things impact those pipelines and women in the space. Like Sarah has found, there's horizontal and occupational segregation in these spaces. So women are less likely to be found in the most core development roles, particularly computer programmers, more often found in ancillary roles or roles that we would associate with sort of a softer skill set. So all of that narrative that we know from gender literature is in this space. We also see that in the game industry, this issue has been getting more and more attention, and it's now becoming quite well known or quite well appreciated that there are problems in the game industry. So in terms of sexism in the content of games, this was really brought to light and received quite a lot of critical attention in recent years by a feminist critic, Nita. That's her in those videos, and she produced a series of them outlining the common tropes of how women were used and portrayed in video games. So that's in terms of the content. We see lots of evidence of women experiencing sexism and misogyny and harassment and discrimination as game players. And I don't know if it shows up very well on this slide, but this website's been around for a long time now, but it says, if you play video games, so are you fat, ugly, or slutty? And it's really speaks to the sort of abuse that women have to take, particularly in online gaming environments. And there's lots of literature around how women have had to often play games as men, or they don't turn their audio on because they don't want to be perceived as women as they're playing games, because then they're treated differently. And in terms of the game development workplaces, there's less literature on the workplaces than the gamers and gaming space itself. but there have been a number of high profile cases over the years. This one with Riot Games, which is a major studio, is right in the middle of a class action lawsuit about gender discrimination. And just this weekend, like literally 4 days ago, there was a massive outpouring on Twitter with allegations surfacing about how women in the live streaming environment are experiencing sexism and harassment. So that's the problem that we're talking about. And there's lots of literature. There have been some interventions. There's been some change, but mostly it's the same old story. And so what we were sort of interested in with this paper is, well, why, right? What is the problem with the problem? Why can't we seem to fix this? And so what we're drawing on when we started looking at these questions, and Amanda really brought this to the paper, is this idea of the work of Carol Bocchi, and it's called the WPR approach. And it really is focusing on this question: what is the problem represented to be? Because maybe what we have here is that we're not talking about the same thing, which is sort of a simple way to think about it. But when you approach the literature, and when you approach people's experiences with this lens, it can be quite revealing. And I just put 2 quotes up here for you. One from Bocchi that says, "What one proposes to do about something reveals what one thinks is problematic or what one thinks needs to change." So the task is subject to this problem representation. The task is to subject this problem representation to critical scrutiny. And in a later paper by McClelland and Holland, they conducted a study of deans of STEM educational programs. And the deans were asked a host of questions about, why are there not more women in your science, tech, engineering, and math programs? And they were kind of came to ask a similar question. So here, when an individual or an organization decides to address the underrepresentation of women, whose behaviors, attitudes, and belief systems are imagined to be in need of changing, right? So what is the question we're asking? And McClelland and Holland found in their study that for the most part, women were perceived as the ones who needed changing, not men and not the system. And that was really kind of spurred our analysis here. So our question in this paper then is, how do men and women in the game industry perceive the problem of diversity? So we use data from these large surveys that the International Game Developers Association has done, and that I've been involved with my colleague Marie-Josée Legault over the years in analyzing. And we use data from the 2014 and the 2015 surveys for this particular research. And there were about 1,700 respondents to each one of those. Not all of them answered these 2 specific questions that we're focusing on. But we asked the whole population, so game developers and also people around the industry in these ancillary roles, 2 questions. What are the obstacles to improving diversity in the game industry? And what are the possible solutions to the lack of diversity in the industry? And these, it was mostly a quantitative survey, but these were open-ended text boxes. And sometimes we got very, very, very long answers that people took the time to write in. So we conducted a thematic analysis of the responses, and we're focusing here on just the responses from people who actually worked in the industry. And we first separated them into, well, what did men say and what did women say? And then we analyzed for themes. So some of the dominant themes that have come through from the perspectives from men from these answers were first the sense that the problem is rooted in a lack of qualified applicants. And there were 2 dominant explanations or manifestations of this sense. One we decided to call natural inclinations. And so this quote is representative, where this man said, "All permutations of races, ethnicity, genders, etc. are not equally interested in developing games. This isn't some massive conspiracy of oppression." So this sentiment is just Well, women don't like doing it. That's why there aren't any women in this industry. And the second side of that, that idea of why the lack of qualified applicants is this notion of societal pressures. And so this man said, the early discouragement of women in general getting into game development and tech careers in general. He says, I'm involved with nonprofit summer camps in game design for kids. During recruitment at events for young children, I can already start to see parents steering their daughters away from tech camps and toward perceived female-oriented camps. So these are the reasons why there aren't qualified applicants coming from female populations. Two other major themes came up in the under the men's perspectives bucket. One was focusing specifically at the education system. And so this person said, sorry, I'm just moving all your faces to the other side so I can see all the words. The education system is at fault, if you will, or it's the problem is there. So this man says there is no diversity issue in the games or tech industry. Employees are basically closely represented by distribution of people doing STEM or computer science degrees. Affirmative action and quotas should never be considered in the first place. Instead, find out why women or minorities decide not to attend STEM or computer science college classes and act there. This is a long-form process that will take a generation's time at the least. This person is not incorrect. The mirroring of the distribution of women in sort of preparatory programs very much mirrors what's going on in the game industry. The trouble is that we've known this for many, many years. So the idea that this is a long form process that will take a generation seems to be particularly true, because despite interventions into the education system, we haven't seen a lot of change. The last theme that emerges here is around the public discourse. And it's important to note that in 2015 in particular was the time of Gamergate, and some of you may have heard of that in the news before, but it was a time of quite vicious online harassment against a number of female game developers that turned into a real campaign around a pushback against feminism and feminist lenses in the industry. So that was part of this context, and we think maybe that's where some of this focus on the public discourse comes from. But this man says, at the moment, the biggest obstacle is a massive stigma the games industry has created for itself. With a media storm of accusations about the game industry being sexist, racist, and misogynistic, I would expect many to avoid the industry based on the reputation alone. We need to show the good and not just the bad if we want to make this industry as inclusive as possible. So now if we counter that a little bit with the main themes that were coming from the women's perspectives, we see a different set of themes. So women talked about the problem being rooted in the ignorance of the problem or the refusal to acknowledge the problem. So this woman, for instance, said, people refuse to acknowledge the existence and harmfulness of prejudices in the industry or the games we make. Until people both acknowledge these problems and actually work towards fixing them, instead of endlessly debating whether they do or do not even exist, we will keep losing the people who have to work 10 times as hard to fit in and be respected by this industry. And I think that sounds a lot like some of what you had heard a little bit too, Sarah. Another bucket or theme that women were talking about was just the idea of the apathy, of the inactivity around change on this issue. And so one woman was saying, fundamentally, the relevant leadership does not perceive diversity as an inherently important goal. Rather, at best, it views a public perception of a lack of diversity as a problem to manage. And two more themes came up for the women's responses. One is around the unconscious harms, so really focusing on the impact that being a marginalized group in the industry plays, and how that contributes to the long-term proclivity of someone to stay in the industry or not. So this woman says it's the culture. It's really hard to explain to someone how hurtful the microaggressions and small mistreatment can be. It's really easy to ignore it, and it makes people feel bad to face the reality that their actions are hurting someone else and have been for a long time. And linked a little bit to the apathy theme is this idea of a lack of active responsibility. So this woman says, it is up to all in the game industry and all gamers to step up and stop tacitly approving, watching, or nodding to this exclusionary behavior, and instead calling that behavior out. And so this is speaking to the idea that the reason why there hasn't been change is because no one is stepping up to take agency for that change. And that has a lot of parallels to the current context in terms of Black Lives Matter struggles and the struggles of Black, Indigenous, and people of color as well. So a lot of these narratives that we're hearing from men and women are not new. They're not particularly new in public understanding of this problem, and they're not particularly new in terms of what we know from the literature already either. But what we think is interesting and what kind of comes from the approach that we're taking here is that when we put those response sets side by side, we can actually see some really interesting things. The primary thing being that men and women are fundamentally talking about different stuff. And so if you're engaged in a conversation in the game industry where you're talking about diversity, people could be speaking about fundamentally different concepts and conceiving fundamentally different potential solutions without perhaps even knowing that they're talking about different things, unless they're really getting into the nitty-gritty specifics. So in general, what we see from men's responses are that the responsibility is not with male colleagues. This is not an issue for men in the game industry. They really point to, in psychology, you would talk about a sort of an external locus of control, right? This is not a problem for me to fix. This is a problem that's out there. Not enough women are landing on our doorstep, so of course we can't hire them. There aren't enough women going into the education system, so how do you imagine there are going to be any applicants, right? This is not for us to fix. We also hear in those perspectives that it's women then who are responsible for the problem and also for the solution. And there's a lot of emphasis, and this came up in McClelland and Holland's work as well, that the emphasis is on women's personal choices and perceptions. If women would only make different choices, they might be a better fit for this industry. What comes out in men's responses is this strong idea of the sort of the egalitarian myth, and this is work that Gail has worked on, that there is an overwhelming emphasis on merit. And we will hire the best applicant for the job, right? We've heard that. It turns out that that best applicant is always a man, but that is never unpacked. And so the sense that the industry is egalitarian and focuses on merit is completely untrue, but it's never interrogated through that male perspective. And we found also overwhelmingly that the questions about the obstacles of diversity in the game industry and the solutions for fixing them, for men, they were focused on recruitment. It's about getting more women to them. And when we see women took a different approach. So women's responses, if we sort of summarize them all across the board, we see that they're talking about much more of an internal process, much more of a lived experience kind of perspective. So the inability for men to see their role in the diversity problem makes women feel frustrated, alienated, maligned, and makes it hard for women to kind of go on in that space. Women are actively seeking, or they're seeking active responsibility from men and people in power, and they're consistently not receiving that. And that makes them unable to go on in some instances in the industry. In the perspectives from women, we see that the egalitarian myth of merit actually silences the narratives of women. It silences their gendered experiences when they were young. It silences their personal interests in games. It silences the particular pathways that they took to get into the game industry, to have made it this far and actually persevered all this amount of time. All of that gets lost when we just look at very standard and objective versions of what merit means. And then women overwhelmingly interpreted the questions around the problem with diversity as one of retention, not one of recruitment. So it's about how do we create environments that women want to be in, not how do we recruit women to an environment that might be hostile to them in certain ways. And this is evident in the pipeline literature as well, that people have criticized the pipeline literature because we might not want to put women in pipes that are yucky, that are hostile to them. So in general, we think this is interesting. I think aspects of it are, as I say, not particularly new, but it's in kind of juxtaposing these positions that we can get to a point where we say, we're not talking about the same thing. The industry is actually seeking solutions to perhaps the wrong problems, and progression towards more equal treatment and representation is therefore not achieved because the interventions are misplaced or an ill fit. And overwhelmingly still, the problem by the dominant majority in these spaces is seen as not their problem, but it's the minority group that's trying to come in. They're the ones who need to change, sometimes fundamentally, in order to live here in this land with us. We don't need to change this land for them. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Johanna. That was a lot for you to unpack, and I think you did a great job digging in at it, and the exploration was eye-opening for sure. We've got a few questions for you. I'm going to rephrase the first one, but really the first one is reflecting on this concept of the high turnover that is part of the gender inequity in the gaming industry. And essentially, it's the million-dollar question. Given what you have uncovered, what are the management implications? What's next? How do we help solve this problem?
Yeah, the problem with turnover is a problem for men and women in the industry, and I think it's a problem because management doesn't care. So the turnover is so high in this industry, and the age of the industry is so young that it is just part of the perceived DNA that this is a young person's industry. This industry requires you to put in massive amounts of personal commitment. And I mean, we didn't even have time to get into the concept of how the structure of the work, how it's project-based and very intensive, is completely antithetical to folks who have families or lives outside of the industry. So that's not conducive to women to begin with, but it's also not helpful for men. But the industry seems to be doing fine because the industry is sexy enough and there are enough desperate young people who want to make games that they can just churn through them like this. And so from an HR perspective, it would be really great. And I have spoken to a lot of human resource managers in this industry who are kind of between a rock and a hard place themselves, because the turnover is just not something that people worry about. It's taken as for granted and completely expected. So that's not seen as part of the problem to fix.
Yeah, definitely. So I know the industry is known to burn and dump employees because it's such a time-sensitive, hyper-competitive industry. If I could just chime in on this one. So I do think that the MBA in me says that if we can get the industry to open their eyes to how much more market capitalization would be available, if there was some forms of equity in the way that games are played and the representation of women in these games, this could be driven as more of a capitalist perspective agenda item rather than an egalitarian perspective item. And generally, that's where investments in these types of hyper-competitive industries happen, is that they're all competing for the same market share. So how do we tell them, wait a minute, you can actually make this pie bigger by trying to get to a unique under-accessed group? So that's my contribution to that one, right?
Yeah, and we should carry on making those arguments, and we'll see. You know, the dominant audience is still the young male gamer, but we are seeing, like in other cultural work, there are niche markets, right? Trying to reach out, and I think the more we see gaming open up through digital distribution and things like that, it's easier to get to target audiences. Yeah.
Nice. There's another question here that we see in the chat function. Speaking about the progress that's been made, some progress has been made for women in tech, but not racialized women. So again, it's that intersection between perhaps visible minority status or other minority status plus the gender minority. So are we seeing this also happening in the gaming subsector?
Yeah, I think racialized men are more prevalent. So there is an intersectionality there that we see lots of white men, and then not balanced in terms of across different ethnicity groups, but definitely good representation from some racialized groups if they're male, and they tend to fare a little bit better. And then we see white women, and then we see, as we know, racialized women who tend to be the least well represented in the space, and then are dealing with challenges because of their multiple identities, their multiple marginalized identities in those spaces. So that's for sure an element. We didn't in this paper tease it out in sort of into those four buckets, but definitely there's work to be done there. And I think there's the emphasis in the industry has been on gender for so long, and it's likely is time to start pulling in a little bit more of that intersectionality piece as well.
And you might see the same conversation that there's equal opportunities, it's merit-based, but your results may again unfold a lot more. There's another question here coming in from Sarah, which is talking about the practice of gender bending and gender identity. Was that something that kind of came up in your research or in your exploration?
It comes up a lot in the study of gamers. So when people are playing games, women report a lot of that gender bending, and there's a pretty robust literature around that, and they do it sometimes for fun, sometimes for protection. If they can play a different character and their avatar looks differently, that allows them to express themselves through the game in a way that they may not be able to if their own demographic identity was front and center. Men also gender bend, just to be fair. The space allows that as well, but and it's a little further off from my base in terms of the literature, but I would expect that they do it more for fun and less for protection.
So that's great. I think there's one more question from Asmita as well. The research point of view. What difference do you see in exploring a digital platform and people engaged on it as compared to the physical platforms of work?
Yeah, so in the game industry, the dominant mode is being in a physical workplace. So game companies are so secretive about their product that they really don't want people working from home. They don't want people to be anywhere but on site. And to get into a game studio, you have to sell one of your children and hold them for ransom, basically. You sign many non-disclosure agreements and go through lots of security. COVID is an interesting thing now because all of a sudden all the game workers went home and they worked from home perfectly well. So that's become an interesting issue. But most of them are in physical workplaces. In terms of the streaming, now this live streaming as in a kind of a new emergent workspace where actual gamers are professional workers now, that's a different environment. And I think there's more overt harassment and discrimination that happens in those environments just because of the enabling, the freeing sense of that anonymous environment that online makes people feel they can have a little bit more license. I can't speak to this specifically because I haven't looked at it, but I would suspect that it's a little bit more subtle in the physical workplaces.
Great. There's two questions that are available for all three of the presenters. So if you feel comfortable answering the question, please, I encourage you to unmute and join on for that. So the first question that came in a little bit earlier was actually during Asmita. So maybe I'll actually direct you, if you can possibly answer this first, Asmita. Is the nonprofit sector in Canada is dominantly female-oriented, mostly female workers. What impact does this have on labor relations in that sector?
Yeah, and not just in Canada, it's only because I did not have appropriate statistics, but I do have a feeling that that's the case in India for sure. And I think that's very intentional because for a very long time, women have been engaged in precarious work and informal and non-formal kind of work, wherein it becomes easier to discriminate and can escape, you know, all of those flaws of the labor laws and everything. And I think that's one very predominant reason why women over-occupy this sector. And yeah, that's what I think. I don't know.
No, that's great. Thank you. So you think that it's one of the reasons why they over-occupy the sectors, and I like how you got into a little bit of the underlying mechanisms there.
Yeah, and all of the theoretical model that I explored around the concept of activity, we did see that in order for those activities to be permanent, to be continuous, there has to be a continuous form of domination that needs to run, and that in my mind, though it was not in my presentation, that in my mind, in terms of labor market, kind of patriarchy, right? Because there is this already forever sort of a dominant system that exists that you can just feed upon, and then yeah, just integrate with all of your workplace learning or workplace systems and everything, and then get on with it without having to fight too much to like make it equitable.
That's fair. Thank you so much. So just to repeat the question again is, given the high presence of women in the nonprofit sector, what impact does this have on labor relations in the sector? So Sarah and Johanna, do you want to build up what Asmita said, or do you want to extend it in any way? You comfortable? All right, let's move on to another question. Asmita, since we have you in the center stage, I think Johanna's got a question for you.
Yeah, great, thanks. Asmita, I'm really interested in that, that NGO and not-for-profit space, and I wonder, you know, I heard when you were giving your presentation, you know, a lot made me think about how these spaces are, you know, people go to work in NGOs because they have a passion for that cause, and often maybe are comfortable in sort of putting themselves in the back seat because they're promoting that cause. And there's a little bit of literature around workplaces that sort of have that idea of almost a calling. And I'm just curious about that, and whether you kind of got a sense of whether that attitude or perception was hindering the workers' abilities to resist or to push back against their own workplace conditions, because they were just so vested in the mission of the whole organization. Does that compromise them in some way?
Definitely it does. And again, like I tried to say this, that this is very intentional, right? Like when you place all of the responsibility on the passion and the effective skills that somebody must develop, and the humanitarian sort of an agenda which drives these nonprofits, it kind of makes it, and then it also again capitalizes a lot on the emotional labor of women in this case. And it then becomes more or less impossible for somebody to, especially women, to kind of fight the system because they've been absorbed into it, and they are shamed. And then again, I would say that all of those, you know, violence that is inherent in patriarchy in terms of morally shaming and everything else, so that is what then comes into the picture. And that kind of prevents all of the resistance, but that also prevents them from in any way organizing or looking at it as if this is something that can be resisted against at all, because we're doing like this from our own very passion and morally correct kind of, and yeah, work. So.
If I could just add a little aside to that, Nita, it may be interesting, the literature on small businesses or a kind of, you know, self-employment or working in a family business, and also union staff So staff of a union who unionize, sometimes those are the most contentious labor relations environments, because you then have this weird disconnect. So in a small business environment or a family business, it's like, how could you possibly resist where there are 5 of us, right? Like, what's your basic problem? And then in the union environment, it really is this idea of, what are you doing, right? We're a union. Obviously, we're a progressive employer. How dare you unionize? So I think there might be some interesting parallels there.
That's really great. And I think that some of the underlying issue too with the nonprofit sector is the concept of working for intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards. So as someone who's active on board of directors of nonprofit, it's that altruistic nature and that concept that we find meaning in our work. And because of that, we're less likely to fight for some of the extrinsic rewards because we're feeling rewarded in other ways, which doesn't perpetuate the inequity, but it is part of the systemic issue of us not stepping up enough and saying that we need our fair share. It's time to be fair, right? We accept a compromise on the extrinsic reward sometimes because we're so internally motivated. Asmita, you still have your mute on.
Sorry. If I can just add to this, so especially in education-based NGOs, so all of these nonprofits, which have usually in places like India and Global South in general, have been funded by big capitalist houses in the West. So what happens is that usually the very higher management is all of management kind of people coming from an MBA and an economics kind of a background, and they would draw like really high salaries, usually all males. And the ones who are actually working on ground are usually people who are from the education sector. And in India, that's the lowest, almost the lowest paid sector. And so again, maintaining those dynamics and there is always a tussle going on that because, if somebody in the management is deciding what you should be teaching on ground without really knowing what teaching even means, but simply maintaining those relations on the basis of a hierarchy, a wage hierarchy, and a patriarchal and racial and all those kinds of hierarchy. So yeah, all of that adds complication to the education sector, I think, in particular.
Exactly, that positional power is part of the imbalance that we're experiencing. That's great. There's a question for all of you as well. It's a common question coming in from Janine, who wants to thank you for your great presentations, but wants to know if you interpret the sexual harassment and the gender blindness in these industries as a way to maintain the white male privilege. Is it to keep women from good and well-paying jobs, or is there a bit more in this underlying issue? It's not about keeping women from jobs, but by perpetuating, almost garbage can theory. We're just perpetuating the systems that have already existed. Sarah, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think that in creating and this hostile work environment in some of these work environments that we've explored, then definitely I think that it perpetuates additional challenges and difficulties for these women. Something additional that I also found was pay equity and disparities in job opportunities and training opportunities for many of the women that I spoke with. Speaking in, for instance, in the mining industry, there's requirements to receive certain qualifications and modules so to work on specific equipment. And it seemed as though many of the women I spoke with, it took them a lot longer, much more time, so to receive these types of opportunities. And I think that's an additional piece that deters them from perhaps even wanting to stay in the industry and perhaps not jump ship over to another industry.
Johanna or Asmita?
Yeah, I think I would just add that it's, change is hard, right? Change is hard for most. And I think there is a difference sometimes between sort of a willful act and what could be said is a legitimate I never realized this was a problem. Now, I think we're in a context today where that argument is holding less and less water, right? And it's harder and harder for individuals to say, I never realized that this was the way it was. But that's really what we hear from women, right? Is this persistent seeming sense that there is not a problem, or that when the problem is exposed, everyone is super surprised, and how that can wear those advocates and those activists in those spaces down over time. So is it an active strategy? I don't know, right? I don't have enough data. I don't know if we could ever know in terms of a generalizable statement about whether this is an active statement by, men or the patriarchy out there. But is the outcome, as Janine describes, yes, right? It is blindness. It is a lack of recognition of something. And that silences, it absolutely silences, and it absolutely invisibilizes the experiences of folks, and those who are strong enough and tough enough stick around. But a lot of people say, you know what, I'm going to go do something else.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Thank you for that. And so it's really this idea that you're talking about, where it comes to, those in power will maintain their power for as long as they can. And it may not be an intentional thing, it may be a systemic thing. And we see the same when it comes to gender discrimination. The gender discrimination is often not blatant gender discrimination, it's systemic gender discrimination in recruitment decisions, promotion decisions, and that's what's all underlying this. Are there any other questions? Well, I think this was a fantastic conversation, and before we started, Asmita and I were talking, and we're like, let's see how these three blend together. And they blended together fantastically. I know that we have spoken about two industries in which women are significantly underrepresented and one in which we're overrepresented, but there's also a discussion about that middle ground. And I think that sometimes we focus in so much on industries that have under and overrepresentation that we're forgetting the industries that have perceived equal representation, perhaps certain industries such as education, but then whether that again is actually equal, simply because the numbers are 40-60 or some ratio there, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are not getting into areas where there may be some biases, where there may be some systemic problems, where there may be misinterpretations or varying interpretations of the same situation. So it's been fantastic.
My daughter snuck in and gave me this bouquet, so I share it with the other wonderful women on my panel.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to meet you.
Enjoy the rest of the session. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.